11:11 p.m. The ticking changed. Ivy Whitmore had lived with that clock her entire life. Even after her father's death, even after marrying Mark and moving into the white colonial on Hawthorne Lane, she had insisted it stand in the center of the living room like a sentry. 200 pounds of oak and brass, 8 feet tall, hand-carved crown molding. 11:11 p.m. The ticking changed. Ivy Whitmore had lived with that clock her entire life. Even after her father's death, even after marrying Mark and moving into the white colonial on Hawthorne Lane, she had insisted it stand in the center of the living room like a sentry. 200 pounds of oak and brass. Ivy stood barefoot on the cool hardwood, wrapped in a cashmere throw. The house was silent except for the refrigerator hum and the faint whoosh of the HVAC kicking on. Mark was upstairs, shower running. Golf tomorrow. Early tea time. He always polished the clock on Sunday nights. Said it relaxed him. The second hand glided to 12. Click. Her pulse synchronized with it. She told herself it was expansion of metal, settling wood, old machinery protesting suburban humidity. But Ivy had grown up in her father's workshop, breathing in oil and brass dust, listening to escapements sing. She knew the difference between analog imperfection and something digital trying to impersonate it. She approached the clock slowly, as if it might spook. The glass door reflected her mid-40s, composed, deliberate. The kind of woman who chaired PTA fundraisers without raising her voice. Neighbors described her as steady. She preferred precise. Her fingers brushed the beveled glass. Warm. To warm. She opened the door and leaned closer. The pendulum swayed in perfect rhythm. The weights hung evenly, nothing visibly altered. And yet, clicked. Her eyes narrowed. Upstairs, water stopped running. Pipes groaned. Mark Whitmore was the sort of man other men trusted with their portfolios. Financial consultant, risk management specialist. He spoke in controlled tones about diversification and liquidity. At block parties, he grilled salmon while explaining market volatility like weather patterns inevitable manageable. He'd insisted on helping maintain the clock when they moved in. I don't want dust settling in the movement, he'd said, already unscrewing the back panel that first Sunday. She remembered thinking it was sweetest attempt to bond with the only thing she refused to modernize. The shower door slid open upstairs. Ivy closed the clock gently and stepped back. The house lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. A flicker, then steady again. Her gaze snapped to the breaker panel across the hallway. Click. Her breath slowed. If it were purely mechanical, it wouldn't sync with the electrical system. Footsteps padded down the stairs. Mark appeared in a white t-shirt, hair damp, towel slung over his shoulder. "You're up late," he said lightly. She turned, arranging her face into something soft. "Couldn't sleep." He followed her gaze to the clock. "Still worried about that thing?" "It sounds different," she said. He smiled, patient, indulgent. "It's 100 years old, Ivy. Things age." She held his eyes. "So do people." It beat. He stepped toward the clock, fingers automatically reaching for the polished wood as if checking a pulse. His thumb brushed a specific seam near the base, quick, unconscious. She noticed. He bent slightly, listening. "Sounds fine to me." The silence stretched between them, elastic and fragile. Up close, she could smell his aftershave chitter and something metallic underneath. Or maybe that was imagination. Clicked. He didn't flinch. She did. Her father used to say a clock reveals character. You can't fake time, he'd tell her. Every lie slips eventually. The gears don't forgive. Mark straightened. "We'll look at it Sunday." "You always do," she said softly. His eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring something invisible. Outside, a car passed slowly down Hawthorne Lane. Headlights slid across the living room walls and vanished. 11:12 p.m. The ticking resumed its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. But Ivy no longer heard time. She heard circuitry hiding behind craftsmanship. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, she wondered who exactly her husband was listening to. Saturday morning unfolded with surgical quiet. Mark left at 6:40 a.m. the same minute he always did on golf days. Ivy watched from the upstairs window as his SUV reversed down the driveway, brake lights flaring red against the pale blue dawn. He waved once, casual. She lifted her hand in return, the picture of routine. The garage door closed. She waited. Not 5 minutes. Not 10. 37. Long enough for him to reach the highway. Long enough that if he'd forgotten something, he would have called. The house settled into stillness. HVAC whispering. Distant lawnmower somewhere down the block. Suburban normalcy humming along like nothing beneath it was rotting. Ivy walked to the grandfather clock. In daylight, it looked harmless, dignified. Sunlight filtered through plantation shutters and caught the brass pendulum in a warm glow. The wood-grain American oak, quarter sawn, still held the faint scent of lemon oil. She knelt. Her fingers traced the lower molding where she'd seen Mark's thumb pause the night before. There a seam that didn't belong. Her father's craftsmanship had been seamless, obsessive. He hated visible alterations. If you can see the repair, he used to say, you failed. This seam was deliberate. Ivy stood, crossed to the kitchen island, and picked up her phone. She didn't scroll contacts immediately. She stared at her reflection in the dark screen. If she was wrong, she would look paranoid. Suspicious wife inventing drama. If she was right, she tapped a name she hadn't called in years. Elias, it's Ivy Whitmore, Daniel Hart's daughter. A pause on the other end, then warmth, surprised. Ivy? I haven't heard that name in a long time. I need you to look at something, she said. Today, discreetly. By 10:15 am. Elias Monroe stood in her living room with a leather tool roll and the careful posture of a man who had spent 40 years bent over intricate machinery. He was in his late 60s, silver hair tied back, wire-rimmed glasses perched low. He circled the clock once without touching it. Your father built this in 24, he murmured. Chicago Exposition piece. I remember when he finished it. Ivy swallowed. It's making a sound. Elias smiled faintly. They all make sounds. Not like this. She described the 1111 clit. The flicker in the lights. The warmth of the glass. The smile faded. He set down his tool roll and slipped on thin cotton gloves. I'm going to open the back, he said. If this is original, well, see immediately. The back panel came off with 4 screws. Elias leaned in. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The stunned kind. What is it? Ivy asked. He didn't answer at first. He adjusted his glasses, then reached deeper inside, fingers navigating beyond the visible escapement. That, he said quietly, is not a 1920 movement. He shifted slightly so she could see. Behind the pendulum assembly concealed within a false brass housing sat a compact black module. Wires threaded cleanly along the interior frame, secured with modern adhesive anchors. A micro antenna coiled upward toward the crown molding. Ivy's stomach tightened. Elias exhaled through his nose. Someone retrofitted this. Recently. What is it? He angled a small flashlight toward the module. A tiny lens, no larger than a pencil eraser, glinted back. 4K camera, he said. Thermal capable. And that he tapped the side gently is a satellite transceiver. Independent signal. Not Wi-Fi reliant. Ivy felt the room tilt slightly. It's powered through the house, Elias continued, tracing a wire that disappeared into the wall cavity. Hardwired. Clean job. Professional. Her voice dropped. How long? Hard to say without logs. But this isn't amateur work. He paused, then added carefully, it's aimed outward. Toward the room. Toward her. Toward Mark's desk in the adjacent study, visible through the open archway. Ivy stepped back as if the lens might pivot toward her. Does it record audio? She asked. Elias examined the housing again. Yes. A thin buzzing filled her ears. Illinois was a 2-party consent state. So was California. Their state North Carolina was 1-party. But installation without disclosure inside a shared marital home, especially for the purpose of surveillance, crossed into federal wiretapping territory. Her voice dropped. How long? Hard to say without logs. But this isn't amateur work. He paused, then added carefully, it's aimed outward. Toward the room. Toward her. Toward Mark's desk in the adjacent study, visible through the open archway. Ivy stepped back as if the lens might pivot toward her. Does it record audio? She asked. Elias examined the housing again. Yes. A thin buzzing filled her ears. Illinois was a 2-party consent state. So was California. Their state North Carolina was one party, but installation without disclosure inside a shared marital home especially for the purpose of surveillance across into federal wiretapping territory, depending on intent. Mark was Elias worked methodically. The way men do when panic would only ruin precision. He didn't disconnect the module. Instead, he traced the wiring into the wall cavity behind the clock and followed it through the basement ceiling, where it merged cleanly, professionally into a secondary junction box Ivy had never noticed. From there, a thin fiber line branched off, separate from the home's visible router system. Redundant transmission, Elias muttered. If Wi-Fi drops, it switches to satellite. Whoever installed this didn't want interruptions. Ivy stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, arms folded tightly but face calm. The air smelled of concrete and detergent. The hum of the dehumidifier filled the silence. Can we see where it goes? She asked. Elias connected a small diagnostic reader from his tool roll, something far more advanced than what a traditional watchmaker typically carried. He caught her glance. I consult on restorations for museums now, he said quietly. Security is part of preservation. The reader pinged. A faint signal pulsed across the screen. Encrypted traffic. Outbound data packets at scheduled intervals. Every night, Elias said, scrolling. 11:11. That's when it initiates full upload. Ivy's jaw tightened. So it records continuously? She asked. Buffers locally, then transmits in batches. Her mind began assembling timelines. Sunday evenings. Mark polishing the clock, adjusting something, ensuring alignment. Can we access the receiving server? She asked. Elias hesitated. That's a line you need to think carefully about crossing. I'm already being recorded in my own home. He nodded once. Fair. He rerouted the signal through his reader. Elias worked methodically. The way men do when panic would only ruin precision. He didn't disconnect the module. Instead, he traced the wiring into the wall cavity behind the clock and followed it through the basement ceiling, where it merged cleanly, professionally into a secondary junction box Ivy had never noticed. From there, a thin fiber line branched off, separate from the home's visible router system. Redundant transmission, Elias muttered. If Wi-Fi drops, it switches to satellite. Whoever installed this didn't want interruptions. Ivy stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, arms folded tightly but face calm. The air smelled of concrete and detergent. The hum of the dehumidifier filled the silence. Can we see where it goes? She asked. Elias connected a small diagnostic reader from his tool roll, something far more advanced than what a traditional watchmaker typically carried. He caught her glance. I consult on restorations for museums now, he said quietly. Security is part of preservation. The reader pinged. A faint signal pulsed across the screen. Encrypted traffic. Outbound data packets at scheduled intervals. Every night, Elias said, scrolling. 11:11. That's when it initiates full upload. Ivy's jaw tightened. So it records continuously? She asked. Buffers locally, then transmits in batches. Her mind began assembling timelines. Sunday evenings. Mark polishing the clock, adjusting something, ensuring alignment. Can we access the receiving server? She asked. Elias hesitated. That's a line you need to think carefully about crossing. I'm already being recorded in my own home. He nodded once. Fair. He rerouted the signal through his reader, isolating the endpoint IP address. Iban said 3 times for offshore routing masks, before stabilizing on a private cloud host. Corporate account, Elias murmured. Registered under a consulting LLC. Ivy felt a flicker of something sharp behind her ribs. Name? He enlarged the registration line. Whitmore Strategic Advisory Group. Mark's firm. Her breathing didn't change. Of course, the man specialized in asset protection and wealth concealment. He advised clients on shielding investments, structuring shell entities, minimizing exposure, layered transfers, smurfing. He clicked through authentication prompts, but he wasn't using his credentials. He was using hers. Her digital signature, file auto-filled. Her IP address stamped the session. He leaned back, calm, clinical. Ivy felt something colder than anger settle into clarity. Identity theft wasn't just someone stealing a credit card. It was assuming a financial persona, leveraging trust structures, exploiting marital access to bypass multi-factor alerts. He minimized the window and opened a document labeled Home Equity Disbursement Schedule. Loan originator, regional lender in Charlotte. Borrower, Ivy Whitmore. Her stomach didn't drop. It sharpened. She had never signed a home equity loan. Yet there it was. Electronic closing acknowledgement. Digital notarization certificate attached. Mortgage fraud required intent and falsified documentation. If her identity had been used without consent, the liability web would initially wrap around her until proven otherwise. And every transfer on that screen tied back to her credentials. Mark glanced toward the living room in the recording toward the clock, toward the eye he believed belonged to him. Then he resumed typing. The file ended. Silence filled the basement. Elias looked at her carefully. Ivy, she lifted her gaze from the screen. Her face was composed, almost detached. This laundering money through my identity, she said quietly. Above them, the grandfather clock ticked. Mechanical, faithful, patient. At 11:11 tonight, it would upload again. But this time, Ivy thought it wouldn't be the only one watching. The house looked unchanged. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors. A delivery truck paused briefly across the street. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler system clicked on a neat suburban rhythm. Inside, Ivy stood at the kitchen counter reviewing the footage again, this time alone. Elias had left with a promise to keep the access channel open, but the house looked unchanged. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors. A delivery truck paused briefly across the street. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler system clicked on a neat suburban rhythm. Inside, Ivy stood at the kitchen counter reviewing the footage again, this time alone. Elias had left with a promise to keep the access channel open, but untouched unless she called. He understood restraint. So did she. She replayed the moment Mark inserted the USB drive. Paused. Zoomed. The label on the device came into focus. WSAC Link Archive. Whitmore Strategic Advisory. Her husband hadn't hidden the branding. That wasn't arrogance. That was confidence. He believed she would never look. Ivy opened her laptop carefully, methodically, and logged into her primary bank account. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Checking balance stable. Joint savings intact. She navigated to mortgage records. There it was. Home equity line of credit for $120,000 approved 6 months ago. Status active. Her digital signature affixed. Closing disclosure acknowledged. She didn't remember signing anything, but she did remember something else. 6 months ago, Mark had insisted they refinance for tax optimization. He'd brought papers home one evening, smiling reassuringly, explaining that electronic consent forms were standard now. Shed-skimmed. Trusted. She opened the loan documentation. The notary verification was remote. Online notarization via third-party vendor. Multi-factor authentication required. Except the authentication phone number listed wasn't hers. It was a secondary number attached to the account Shed never noticed. A Google Voice proxy. Her lips pressed together. Mortgage fraud often hinged on falsified acknowledgments. If a borrower claimed identity misuse, the burden shifted to demonstrating that electronic verification was compromised. Banks relied heavily on digital consent logs, IP addresses, device IDs. Mark had used her laptop, her fingerprint, her home network. He'd built a paper trail that pointed in one direction, toward her. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. International wires structured below $10,000 to avoid CT or triggers. Layered transfers routed through shell accounts. Funds cycling back into a trust account managed by Whitmore Strategic. Classic layering phase of money laundering. And the primary initiating party according to records was Ivy Whitmore. Her gaze drifted to the living room. The clock stood tall, serene, innocent. She walked toward it slowly. Sunlight caught the glass. She saw her reflection again, but something in her expression had shifted. The softness was gone. What remained was calculation. He hadn't just monitored her. He curated evidence. If federal investigators ever flagged the wire activity, the digital footprint would show her credentials initiating transactions during late-night sessions while Mark conveniently traveled for client meetings. He had insulated himself. She knelt before the clock and opened the glass door gently. "Tick, tick, tick. Why 11:11?" she murmured. "Symbolic? Ritualistic? No. Predictable upload time. A constant. A metronome for data transfer." Her mind mapped possibilities. If she confronted him now, he would deny everything and perhaps accelerate whatever final move he was planning. If she went directly to law enforcement, she risked triggering scrutiny before she understood the full scope. No, she needed leverage, proof of intent, proof that the surveillance and financial manipulation, and for the first time since discovering the module, she allowed herself a thin, controlled smile. If Mark believed he controlled the lens, he hadn't considered what happened when the subject learned to watch back. By late afternoon, Ivy had built a timeline. 6 months of transactions, 12 structured wire clusters, 3 offshore jurisdictions, 1 home equity line funding the initial liquidity. Every move precise, repetitive, controlled. Mark's style. She printed nothing. Screenshots were saved to an encrypted drive Elias had shown her how to mount. Metadata intact. Hash values preserved. If this ever reached federal court, chain of custody would matter. She returned to the grandfather clock. Elias had left the access tunnel open, routed quietly through a hidden monitoring node. The camera still transmitted to Mark's cloud server, but now it mirrored to her encrypted drive as well. She pulled up the administrative console tied to Whitmore's strategic advisory. The login credentials were auto-filled on her laptop. Of course they were. Mark trusted convenience. She entered her fingerprint. Access granted. A dashboard unfolded. Client portfolios, offshore partnerships, risk allocations, and another tab labeled private holdings. She clicked. A separate ledger appeared. Unlisted assets, cryptocurrency wallets, cold storage references. Her pulse remained steady. There it was. Wallet it associated with a Bitcoin reserve established in 2013. Origin deposit Daniel Hart. Her father. Ivy leaned back slowly. Her father had been brilliant but secretive about investments in his later years. He'd once joked about future-proofing time itself. She'd assumed it was philosophical. It wasn't. The wallet balance displayed fluctuating numbers that would make most hedge fund managers blink. Mark hadn't stumbled into that. He'd been searching. She scrolled deeper. A folder labeled Access Key Reconstruction. Inside were notes Mark's notice and gear cipher alignment. Her breath cooled. Her father had designed the clock's internal gear teeth with subtle variations, microscopic differences in length and spacing. She remembered him measuring them obsessively, refusing standard templates. He'd once told her, patterns hide in plain sight. Mark had figured out there was something hidden but not the method. He was trying to reverse engineer the cipher from surveillance footage, likely capturing her interactions with the clock over months, watching, waiting for her to reveal something unconsciously. She opened another video from the archive. Timestamp 3 nights ago. Mark sat alone in the study, speaking quietly to Ivy, not to a client, to someone on speakerphone. The audio was clear. "She hasn't accessed it yet," he said. "The inheritance is locked behind the gear sequence. Once I confirm the hash key, I can liquidate through the Belize conduit." A woman's voice responded, younger, confident. "And the wife? She's covered," Mark replied. "If anything flags, the digital trail points to her. Worst case, she claims ignorance. Best case, she takes the fall." Silence stretched in the basement. Ivy didn't blink. Identity theft, mortgage fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, potential federal wiretap violations depending on how the surveillance extended beyond the home network. He had layered contingencies, but he had made one mistake. He believed she was passive. Her eyes shifted back to the gear cipher notes. If he was reconstructing the key based on observation, then she could give him something to observe. Upstairs, the house remained quiet, suburban, orderly. At 11:11 p.m., the clock would click. Tonight, Ivy decided it would broadcast a message Mark was meant to hear and believe. Mark came home at 9:18 p.m. He carried the faint scent of bourbon and cedar, the practiced ease of a man who believed the day had gone according to plan. Ivy was at the stove, stirring a pan of sauce that had long since reduced beyond necessity. The grandfather clock stood behind her, pendulum gliding. Tick, tick, tick. You didn't eat? He asked, setting his keys down in their usual bowl. I wasn't hungry. He kissed her temple brief, perfunctory. You okay? She met his eyes for half a second longer than routine required. I've been thinking about Dad. He paused slightly. The clock again? She nodded. He moved toward it instinctively, as if summoned. Ivy turned down the burner and watched him in the reflection of the microwave door. He opened the glass, fingers grazing the pendulum, the weights, the seam near the base. He checked it every Sunday. Tonight was Thursday. Still making that nose? He asked lightly. Yes. He leaned closer, ear tilted. 11:10 p.m. The house felt electrically charged. Every appliance hum magnified. Every shadow sharpened. Ivy dried her hands on a dish towel and walked into the living room. She stopped just behind him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, far enough to remain unreadable. The clock struck 11. The mechanical chime filled the room, low, resonant, then clicked, subtle, artificial. Mark didn't react, but Ivy saw the micro-tension in his shoulders. Anticipation. The upload had begun. He closed the glass panel gently. Sounds fine, he said. She let silence linger, then spoke evenly. Do you ever think about what Dad hid in here? He stilled. Hidden? He repeated casually. He was always layering things, she said. Design inside design. He used to talk about protecting legacy. Mark's face remained neutral, but his pupils tightened slightly. Legacy in a clock, he said with a small laugh. Maybe not money, she said, but something. She moved around him and knelt before the base panel. Slowly, deliberately, she removed the lower molding piece, something she had loosened earlier with Elias' help. Mark watched carefully now. Inside, the gears gleamed. Ivy reached in and adjusted 3 specific cogs in sequence off-center, right, pausing between each. Not random. Measured. She felt his gaze burn into her back. Dad showed me once, she murmured. Said if I ever needed it. She let the sentence trail. The gears clicked softly as she finished the sequence. In the basement, mirrored footage captured everything. Mark swallowed. Needed what? She stood, dusting her hands. Insurance, she said simply. Tick, tick, tick. His mind was moving fast, Nash could see it. Calculating possibilities. Reassessing timelines. If she had access to the cipher, he would need to accelerate. Good. Let him. He stepped closer, tone shifting subtly. Ivy, if there's something valuable tied to that clock, we should talk about it. Transparency. She smiled faintly. Of course. Her expression was smooth, unreadable. Upstairs, her laptop recorded both audio and video streams in parallel, metadata time-stamped, geolocation stamped, integrity hashes generating automatically. If he attempted another transfer tonight, it would be captured. If he referenced the inheritance again, it would be documented. The clock ticked toward 11 hours, 11 minutes, and 30 seconds. Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at it. A message. Ivy didn't need to see the screen to know who it was from. The accomplice. The clock clicked once more, upload complete. Mark's jaw tightened just slightly. He had seen enough. I have a few emails to send, he said calmly. Work. Of course, Ivy replied. He walked into the study. Ivy remained in the living room, facing the clock. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, expressionless. Above her, unseen by him, the camera she now controlled continued to watch. And for the first time since the ticking began to sound wrong, she felt in control of the time left. Mark closed the study door. Not fully. An inch of space remained at habit, not oversight. He liked to hear the house, to monitor ambient noise, to detect deviation. Ivy didn't move toward it. She walked calmly upstairs instead, entered the bedroom, and closed her own door with deliberate softness. Then she opened her laptop. The mirrored feed from the grandfather clock camera populated instantly. Infrared adjusted to low light. Mark's silhouette settled into her desk chair. He didn't waste time. The USB drive appeared again. Inserted. The financial dashboard opened. Ivy watched his face carefully at the screen. The screen she already understood. It was his micro-expressions that mattered now. He navigated to the cryptocurrency ledger, then to a separate secure messaging app. Text populated rapidly on his screen. Your alignment confirmed. She accessed it tonight. Pause. She doesn't understand the full key yet. Another pause. They'll extract within 48 hours. Ivy exhaled slowly through her nose. Good. He believed she was naive, curious, but uninformed. He clicked into the home equity account. Available balance, $312,000 remaining. He initiated a draw request, $9,750. Structured. Again, he routed it through the Belize conduit listed in his notes. Before he hit confirm, his phone buzzed. He answered quietly, unaware that audio streamed clearly through the mirrored channel. Yeah, he said, a woman's voice filter, but recognizable, responded. We need to accelerate. Compliance flagged something on the Cyprus side. Mark leaned back. It's contained. The digital trail's clean. And the surveillance? Still operational, he replied. She hasn't touched it. Ivy's lips curved faintly. Federal law under 18 U.S.C. 2511 criminalized intentional interception of oral communications without consent when expectation of privacy existed. Even in one-party consent states, marital surveillance installed covertly for criminal enterprise crossed into prosecutable territory, specially if data crossed state lines via satellite relay. Mark had created exposure far beyond a divorce dispute. Once the Bitcoin clears, the woman said, we disappear. He nodded once, decisive. 48 hours. He ended the call and confirmed the transfer. Ivy watched the transaction populate. She recorded it, time-stamped it, hash preserved. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, confident. Then he did something new. He opened a draft document labeled Statement of Spousal Authorization. Ivy's gaze sharpened. The document was a prepared affidavit per written asserting that she had consented to strategic financial maneuvers in support of his advisory firm. Language carefully constructed, plausibly deniable, framed as mutual investment decisions. He intended to have her sign it, or forge it. Her heartbeat remained steady. She minimized the feed and opened a separate encrypted messaging window. Elias had connected her earlier to a federal financial crimes attorney, Rachel Donovan, former assistant U.S. attorney specializing in mortgage fraud and identity theft. Ivy typed 3 words, his moving funds. Within seconds, Rachel replied, do not confront. Continue documentation. We're coordinating. Ivy closed the laptop and stood. Downstairs, the clock ticked with pristine innocence. Mark emerged from the study moments later, face composed. All set, he said casually. For tonight? Ivy asked. For everything, he replied. She held his gaze, expression neutral. Good, she said. He kissed her cheek again. If he noticed anything different in her eyes, he didn't show it. The clock ticked toward midnight. 48 hours, he had said. Ivy smiled faintly. He wouldn't need that long. Friday arrived with a brittle kind of brightness. The kind of morning that made everything look clean. Ivy poured coffee into 2 identical white mugs and placed one at Mark's usual seat. He scanned his phone while eating, posture relaxed, thumb moving in small, efficient motions. He looked like a man managing clients, not a man preparing to disappear. You have plans today? He asked without looking up. A few errands, she said. He nodded. I might be in and out. Translation, he would be watching. The mirrored feed from the clock camera continued streaming quietly to Ivy's encrypted drive. Rachel Donovan had spent half the night reviewing what Ivy had already sent: transaction logs, audio clips, the affidavit draft. Mortgage fraud exposure is significant, Rachel had said on their secure call. If he executed a home equity line using forged authentication and misrepresented borrower intent, that's federal. Identity theft layered on top increases penalty exposure. Add wire fraud has looking at serious time. And the surveillance? Ivy had asked. If he installed recording equipment without your consent to facilitate financial crime, We can argue federal wiretap violations, especially given the interstate transmission. Rachel's tone had been calm, controlled, the voice of someone who had dismantled schemes like this before. Do not spook him, Shed warned. Let him move. So Ivy moved instead. Mid-morning, she entered the living room with deliberate purpose. She knelt at the clock again, visible, intentional, and adjusted the same 3 gears as before. Then she did something new. She reached deeper. Behind the pendulum housing, hidden within a recess her father had carved decades ago, lay a small brass cylinder no larger than a lipstick case. She removed it. Mark's office door upstairs creaked faintly. He was home, watching. Good. She stood, holding the cylinder thoughtfully, and walked toward the study archway but stopped just short of entering. Instead, she returned to the living room and placed the cylinder on the coffee table. In full view of the camera, she didn't open it. She simply let it exist. Then she left the house. Mark waited 12 minutes before emerging. The mirrored feed captured everything. He approached the coffee table slowly, scanning the room, first habitual paranoia disguised as caution. He picked up the brass cylinder, turned it in his hand. His pulse was visible at his throat. He opened it. Inside was a small strip of paper, a sequence of alphanumeric characters, part of a key, not the full one, just enough to tempt. Mark's breathing shifted. He looked toward the clock toward the lens he believed still belonged to him. I knew it, he whispered. He took a photo of the strip, then replaced it carefully, resealed the cylinder, and returned it to the table exactly as he'd found it. Precision mattered to him. Upstairs, he moved quickly. The laptop opened. The crypto ledger reappeared. He entered the partial key into the wallet interface. Access denied. He frowned, then opened a separate program reconstruction software. He overlaid the partial string with his own cipher mapping notes derived from months of surveillance. Pattern recognition algorithms began running. Ivy, parked 2 streets away in her car, watched the mirrored feed on her phone through a secure connection Rachel's team had established. Is this enough? She asked quietly. Rachel's voice came through her earpiece. It's attempting unauthorized access to digital assets tied to interstate financial instruments, combined with the wire transfers and forged mortgages. On screen, Mark initiated another transfer from the home equity line, larger this time, $24,500. He was escalating, desperation tightening his judgment. Let him finish, Rachel said calmly. Mark routed the funds through the Belize conduit again, then initiated a crypto purchase tied to the partial key wallet. His screen froze momentarily, processing. Behind the scenes, federal financial monitoring systems already alerted by Rachel's pre-coordination flagged the abnormal pattern. Multiple rapid transfers, structured withdrawals, attempted high-value crypto conversion. The trap was closing. Mark leaned back, satisfied. He believed he was seconds away from unlocking a fortune. He didn't realize the key Ivy had given him wasn't just partial. It was tagged, embedded with traceable metadata linked to the very account he was now contaminating. From her car, Ivy watched his confidence crest. She didn't smile. She simply whispered, "Time's up." The clock read 11:09 p.m. when the doorbell rang. Mark froze. He was in the study again, laptop open, transaction windows still active. The Belize conduit had processed. The crypto purchase showed pending confirmation. He had just attempted the second Fastful wallet reconstruction when the notification banner flickered across his screen. Transaction under review. He frowned. The doorbell rang again. Firm. Official. Ivy stood in the living room, exactly where she had positioned herself an hour earlier. Calm. Hands folded lightly in front of her. Sit. 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 Mark stepped into the hallway. Are you expecting someone? No, she said evenly. The third ring wasn't a ring at all. It was a knock. Measured. Controlled. Law enforcement didn't pound unless necessary. Mark's jaw tightened. Stay here. He approached the front door, posture composed, face already shifting into professional neutrality, consultant greeting a client. He opened it. 2 agents stood on the porch. Dark suits. Credentials displayed with quiet authority. Mr. Whitmore, the older one asked. Yes. We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to search the premises in connection with suspected wire fraud, mortgage fraud, and identity theft. The words landed without drama. They didn't need it. Mark blinked once. Only once. There must be a misunderstanding. Sir, step aside. Ivy watched from the living room as they entered. The grandfather clock loomed behind her, pendulum swinging in unwavering rhythm. The second agent moved immediately toward the study, guided by prior intelligence. Rachel had been precise. Digital forensics teams had already mirrored Mark's cloud server through subpoena channels triggered earlier that afternoon. The flagged crypto transactions provided probable cause. The home equity irregularities strengthened it. The covert surveillance moduleons documented ads sealed it. Mark turned toward Ivy. For a moment, something almost human crossed his face. Confusion, calculation, then recognition. You did this, he said quietly. She held his gaze. No, she replied. You did. An agent emerged from the study. Laptop secured. Active financial dashboard open. Another voice from the doorway. External surveillance hardware located in living room structure. Mark's composure fractured microscopically. You installed recording equipment without my knowledge, Ivy said calmly, loud enough for the agents to hear. You used my identity to obtain a home equity loan. You structured international transfers under my credentials. Don't speak, Mark snapped reflexively. The older agent turned slightly. Sir, you may want to consider counsel. At precisely 11:11 p.m., the clock emitted its now familiar sound. Tick, tick, chime, then click. The dry electronic relay echoed through the room. An agent glanced toward it. That's the device. Yes, Ivy said. For the first time since this began, Mark looked at the clock not as an asset, not as a puzzle, as evidence. Cold metal cuffs closed around his wrists with a muted finality. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and mortgage fraud, the agent stated. You have the right to remain silent. Mark's eyes found Ivy one last time, not pleading, not apologizing, calculating whether there was still an angle left. There wasn't. As they led him past the clock, the pendulum continued its steady arc, mechanical, unforgiving. The front door closed behind them. Silence returned. The house felt larger now, emptier. Ivy stood alone in the living room, the mirrored feed still active on her phone, recording the final moments of a scheme built on precision and undone by time. The clock ticked, but for the first time in months, it sounded purely mechanical. The house went into escrow 3 weeks later. Word traveled quickly through Hawthorne Lane, but Ivy kept explanations simple. Financial complications, she said when neighbors asked. It's time for a change. The truth required federal indictments and sealed affidavits. Mark's arrest had unfolded cleanly. Digital forensics confirmed what Ivy had documented: unauthorized home equity disbursements executed under falsified authentication, structured wire transfers designed to evade reporting thresholds, and covert surveillance equipment installed to facilitate identity theft and financial fraud. The affidavit he had drafted, his contingency was found saved but unsigned. Intent mattered, so did metadata. The brass cylinder remained on the coffee table until the day the movers arrived. Ivy opened it one final time. Inside was not a cryptocurrency key. Not really. The string she had planted had been generated by Rachel's team traceable tagged, legally admissible bait. When Mark attempted to merge it with the existing wallet hash, he had effectively tied his own credentials to the monitored account. He had contaminated himself. Her father's actual Bitcoin reserve, Rachel's forensic accountants later confirmed it existed, but the true access key had never been in the clock. It had been in a safety deposit box under Daniel Hart's name, transferred quietly into Ivy's control years earlier. The gear cipher, a decoy layered into the craftsmanship, a puzzle for anyone greedy enough to look. On her last night in the house, Ivy stood before the grandfather clock one final time. The surveillance module had been removed under warrant, the interior restored as closely as possible to its original configuration. Elias had spent hours recalibrating the escapement, polishing brass that had been dulled by modern intrusion. When the clock struck 11, The sound was whole again, resonant, warm, no click. She ran her fingers along the wood grain. Her father had built more than a timepiece. He had built redundancy, protection hidden inside beauty. She thought about Mark's final expression, how quickly calculation gave way to inevitability. Financial predators relied on silence, on trust, on the assumption that their target would panic or deny. She had done neither. Instead, she had documented, preserved, waited. Suburban life had taught her routine. Her father had taught her pattern recognition. Rachel had taught her patience. Ivy didn't take the entire clock with her. It was too large, too tied to that living room. Instead, she removed the original movement carefully boxed by Elias and left the outer case to the buyers, who admired it purely as decor. Time itself traveled with her. The morning she handed over the keys, she stood in the empty foyer, sunlight cutting through the space where the clock had stood. No hum of hidden electronics, no unseen lens, just quiet. Her phone vibrated on an update from Rachel. Indictment filed. Multiple counts. Asset freeze expanded. Ivy read it, then slipped the phone into her pocket. Outside, a moving truck idled. She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her without looking back. Time, her father used to say, reveals everything eventually. He had been right, and this time, she was the one keeping it. What lingers with me about Ivy's story isn't the arrest or even the sophistication of the fraud. It's the quiet discipline. In a world where betrayal often triggers immediate confrontation, she chose restraint. She documented instead of detonating. She learned the system before she tried to fight it, and that is what saved her. Financial abuse rarely begins with dramatic theft. It begins with convenience. Shared passwords. They'll handle it. Digital signatures sent late at night. Trust slowly converted into leverage. Ivy's strength wasn't just that she uncovered the scheme, it was that she understood the power of evidence over emotion. In cases involving identity theft, mortgage fraud, or covert surveillance, the truth isn't what you feel, it's what you can prove. There is also something deeper here about awareness. We tend to believe danger looks chaotic, but often it looks orderly, respectable, well-dressed. It lives in quiet neighborhoods and uses polished language. The lesson isn't paranoia. It's literacy, financial literacy, digital literacy, legal literacy. Know what your name is attached to. Know what you've signed. Know who benefits from your silence. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question, if something in your life starts ticking differently subtly, repeatedly, would you dismiss it? Or would you look closer? Have you ever discovered that trust was being misused in ways you didn't initially see? Did you confront it immediately? Or did you gather information first? What signs in hindsight were already there? If Ivy's story resonates with you, whether through financial betrayal, digital privacy violations, or simply learning to trust your instincts, it invites you to share your experience. What did you learn? What would you tell someone who suspects something isn't right, but can't yet prove it? Sometimes the most powerful defense isn't force, it's patience.